Welcome back to the next edition of our 25 for 25 podcast as we speak to so many people in the space and celebration of our own 25th anniversary. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Patrick Vernon.
This is 25 for 25, a Show Racism the Red Card podcast. Make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
I'm not sure where to start in introducing him. OBE, historian, author, journalist. Where else? Honorary doctorate. I can also add. Patrick, have I left anything out?
Well, it's fun. We haven't got time, but it's cool.
Patrick, thanks for joining me. You're most noted for your work in exposing the Windrush scandal.
Sure.
Talk to me a little bit about the scandal, related you to it, and your work in uncovering it.
Sure. Well, before the scandal, I mean, I've always had an interest in family history, the history of the Windrush Generation. I mean, my parents, they came from Jamaica in the late 1950s. They settled in Wolverhampton, where I was born, along with my sisters. And I've always had this interest in family history. So, I mean, exactly it's 20 years this year that I launched my very first website called Every Generation. And that website was a resource to help people trace their roots, their Caribbean roots to Africa, and as well as looking at African roots in Africa itself. And because I had this interest in family history, and so it's really through that work around my own family history, tracing my roots from Jamaica to, and then I was eventually traced it to Senegal. And then on top of that, with the website, I interviewed lots of elders in the community, profiled them as well. So really, that's how it all started. And then I got to know one particular elder. His name was Eddie Martin Noble, born in 1917 in Jamaica, came to Britain in 1943 as a 25-year-old, volunteered for the RAF, like with the other 15,000 West Indians that served during the Second World War. And he stayed on, whereas lots of them went back, were demobbed, went back to the Caribbean, and some of them came back on that historic journey on the Windrush ship in June 1948. Eddie actually stayed on in Britain. He had various jobs. He worked in the rag trade. At one stage, he ran an exclusive luxury car taxi business. And he used to tell me stories that he used to pick up Max Bygraves and Cilla Black, take him to London Palladium, and all that. He had an interesting job. Anyway, to cut long story short, I met him in his twilight years. He was living in sort of shelter accommodation in Hackney, and I didn't live that far from him, a couple of miles away. And the reason why I got to hold him, but knew him, and this is quite important. He wrote his memoirs in 1984 called Jamaican Airman, and it's one of the very first books which describes the West Indian contribution to the lived experience of the Second World War, and also his experience of dealing with racism and discrimination, basically. And so I got to know him. I made this documentary about his life. He passed away in 2007. I made this documentary about his life in 2008 called The Charmed Life. This documentary was really about celebrating the Windrush Generation contribution to Britain, and particularly our contribution to the Second World War. And I was approached by the Guardian newspaper to write a blog about the documentary, and they showed clips of it on their website. And I wrote this article, and I said, and this is around about 2009-10, I said, wouldn't it be fantastic when we approach the 70th anniversary of celebrating Windrush in 2018, that Britain acknowledged and celebrated the Windrush contribution? That was my kind of question to that. I mean, there have been a lot of work before that. I mean, you've got Sam King, who was one of the original passengers on the Empire Windrush ship. He formed the Windrush Foundation with Arthur Torrington, and they organised quite a few events. But what I was saying, and they started Windrush Day to be quite funny, but I wrote an article saying, why can't we have Windrush Day every year? Why should we wait every 10 years? That was my starting point. And then a lot of people were interested in the idea of, and then I worked with Sam King and others, and we launched a campaign working with an organisation called British Futures for the idea of an annual day for celebration of the Windrush Generation. So that was my starting point. How the scandal happened, as we now know, this was been brewing for the last 20, 30 years under conservative Labour governments now, and then it was under the Watch and coalition government. So this was nothing new. The Immigration Act of 2015, which created, now we know, as the hostile environment policy, meant that, and obviously this policy was on the premise that they wanted to reduce net migration figures, people leaving Britain, wanted to reduce the number of people who was deemed to be illegal. So if you remember, I don't think there was the racist go home bans that were going around Britain saying if you're legal, go back home. But actually, these ones were so indiscriminate. A lot of people who were of colour, black and brown people, thought, was this targeting me? It was just completely indiscriminate.
Yeah.
But the hostile environment policy and the legislation, which created a change in law, which meant that you had to have documentary evidence to prove that you're British or access a range of services, using healthcare, getting your pensions, your benefits. Basically, if you want to rent property, buy property, you have to have documented evidence to prove that you're British. And they thought by doing this policy, that would try and get rid of illegal immigration. But what did it do it was by design or default, it was done deliberately. I mean, if you speak to a lot of Windrush victims, they think it was done deliberately. That it had an impact on the Windrush generation, the children. So those people that came to Britain as children, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and early 70s, on their parents' passports. Remember, the 1948 British Nationality Act meant that anyone from the colonies could come to Britain as British. Even though ironically that legislation was actually aimed at people who were Australians, people from South Africa, New Zealand people, Canadians, but we took advantage of that. And they didn't need to, and the children didn't need to have separate passports because they were deemed to be British. But many of these children who are now in their 50s and 60s, and many of them didn't travel, because many of them were working, having a whole variety of working-class jobs. And it's been estimated anyway that maybe 20% or 30% of the population in Britain don't have passports. So you don't need to. Do you need to have a passport to prove that you're British? Well, the way things are going with the Windrush scandal, the hostile environment policy, and the proposed bill in Parliament around the Immigration Borders Bill, it seems that way, especially if you're a person of colour. So many of these children, the Windrush generation in the 1560s, who had worked, many of them had worked in public services, NHS, got children, grandchildren, didn't have paperwork from the time they were children to prove they were British. And because they couldn't prove it, and plus the Home Office were asking onerous questions, i.e., we want to have 4 pieces of written evidence from the time that you came to Britain. Now, come on, you arrive here as a 10-year-old. Yeah. What evidence can you have every year that you've been in Britain for the last 40, 50 years? It was done deliberately as a high standard bar, meaning that they knew full well that people wouldn't have a whole range of documented evidence. So they were deemed as illegal. People lost their jobs, lost their pension rights, made homeless. Some people were deported, some people were threatened with deportation. People who were coming back on holidays weren't allowed to come back into Britain. And for some people, spent time in detention centres while they were working up their status. Amelia Gentleman, who was a Guardian journalist, has done a fantastic job in exposing these. So she started writing articles around about 2017, highlighting a number of individuals such as Paulette Wilson, Anthony Bryant, a whole range of independent people who have been exposed by this hostile environment policy. But it wasn't until 2018 that we knew that scandal happened as we knew it as a scandal, because people just felt that these individuals or these poor Caribbean people, they haven't sorted their paperwork. The Home Office deliberately gave the impression that it was their fault, that they haven't sorted out their paperwork. But as I was reading these cases, and I've been a former counsellor in Hackney, I was approached by one particular individual, Iwaldo Romeo, who actually later found out that his younger brother is Jazzy B from Soul to Soul.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, but he didn't want to talk about that, because otherwise it'd be more about him than my
of course.
whole case. So we kept that. We didn't talk about it at all. But I helped him with his case, and what I did, based on the difference with Iwaldo, he was born in Antigua, came to Britain as a 4-year-old, but he did have a British passport. piece to do travelling. Lost his passport, and when he tried to get a new passport from the passport office, they said that we haven't got any evidence that you're British. Why can't you get an Antiguan passport? I said, no, I had a British passport. I want my British passport back, please.
Mm-hmm.
And he got caught up in the Windrush scandal, threatened with deportation. So I realised, hold on, if he's got a British passport and he's been classed as an illegal immigrant, even though he's been here for 50 odd years, what about the rest of the people? And that's why I did a petition on the UK government website, which about 200,000 people signed. That led to it was a campaign, and in my petition, 3 things I wanted: automatic status for the Windrush Generation. Secondly, end deportation flights, because at the time the government were ramping up deportation flights, which is still here, sadly. And thirdly, compensation for loss and hurt.
Mm-hmm.
The turning factor, which led to Theresa May, the Prime Minister, apologising, was when she refused to meet the Caribbean heads. They had been raising some concerns for a number of years. They wanted to have a meeting with her. It was the same time as the Commonwealth Summit meeting was taking place in London, which he was hosting with the Queen. And there was so much pressure on her that she eventually had a meeting, and then that's when she apologised didn't apologise to the Windrush Generation in the UK. She actually apologised to the Caribbean governments. I don't know about you, about your roots, Shaka, but I mean, I was born, I've got Jamaican roots, but I'm born here and British. They should apologise to the people in Britain, not to all the 13 speaking English Caribbean islands that have been affected. Anyway, to cut long story short, that led to the government apologising and putting things in place to try in their attempts to sort out the scandal, which I don't think they have done effectively.
Well, to answer the latest of your questions around my roots, my parents are both Trinidadian. My dad moved to England in the early 60s as a teacher, as part of that generation. Came up, worked in the post offices, worked on the buses, eventually trained and became a teacher. And then he was wrongfully arrested and sued the Metropolitan Police, won a record settlement, and used that to put himself through law school. So I was also born in England while my dad was finishing law school. But once he finished, he moved back to Trinidad and Tobago, where both he and my mom were from. But I think largely because of his experiences at the hands of the Metropolitan Police. Though there was a positive outcome, I think he was jarred to the point that he needed to return to Trinidad and Tobago. And I think it's important to remember why so many people made that journey. It was after, as you mentioned, World War II, and the destruction, and they needed a labor force to rebuild Britain. And many in the Caribbean islands answered that call. And then all of a sudden, it felt as though now that that rebuilding was done, though they were British at the very least when they first left the Caribbean, they were now deemed illegal and they would try to be intimidated into leaving. So I think that's an important aspect to this around why people emigrated in the numbers that they did. But yes, you're absolutely right. An apology is needed to the Black community. And I think you're being kind when you say whether it was by design or accident that our communities were impacted in the way that they are. Our communities just tell too many of these stories to simply accept that these things are byproducts or by accident anymore. But since your work, since that Theresa May apology, what has changed, and in what scope?
Okay, so what's changed? So when Theresa May apologised in April 2018, the government did 3 things. Firstly, they stopped all deportation flights because they couldn't demonstrate or prove that the people they were deporting they could be British. So the deportation flights were suspended for about 18 months. But as you know, they've started that again. Secondly, they introduced what was then called the Windrush Task Force, which meant that anyone that was undocumented, remember all these people that were affected were undocumented, they couldn't prove they were British, even though they were British in the first place, could get a biometric card and definitely prove that at some degree of status here. So it's been estimated maybe up to about 13,000 people have had their status, inverted commas, regularised, not given them full citizenship, but regularised. I have to emphasise that. And then the third thing, as part of the government's apology, they said that they would compensate those individuals that were affected by the hostile environment policy, Windrush scandal. Remember, people lost their jobs. Some people had been working for years and years, lost their jobs, had to borrow money from friends and family to survive. Some people were actually made homeless because if they were living in social housing accommodation and they couldn't prove they were British, they were basically made homeless by the local authorities and housing associations, and people who did lose their jobs couldn't afford to maintain paying the mortgage, so they lost their properties and they became homeless. So a lot of people lived in temporary accommodation. People couldn't access their pensions because they couldn't prove. People couldn't access the NHS. It goes on and on. So the government said, well, we will compensate for this loss and suffering. They spent a year to have a consultation on what the scheme should look like. Launched in April 2019. To date, just under 400 people have received compensation out of a potential number of 15,000. 400 people out of a potential number of 15,000. And even though the government says we've given out 30 odd million, the government said that we've offered just under 40 million pounds, but it's an offer. Most of those claims have been rejected because the average claim is less than £10,000. Just imagine you're working for all these years, you lose your job, and they're not even giving you a full salary for each year that you lost your job. They're giving you a partial amount for 1 year. The amount of money they've offered is just ridiculously low. They're not giving proper compensation around the impact on your physical health, your mental health. Lots of these Windrush people are suffering from depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's been estimated in the UK alone, and there might be more in Africa and the Caribbean, that about 23 people have died waiting for compensation. It's outrageous. It really is. It's almost like, and that's why a lot of you speak to the Windrush victims or survivors, I should say, they feel that the government, and I feel the same as well, there is no intent to pay people properly for the loss, to sort out people's status, the government, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, used the expression "righting the wrongs," which is a bit rich, because if she believed in righting the wrongs, she'd be righting the wrongs. She's not righting the wrongs. They're just trying to pay the minimum amount of money to get these people off their back. So either people are waiting 23 people have died waiting for compensation. It's outrageous. And so a lot of people are saying in the black community, if this was any other community, why are we treated in this so disrespectful way? For taking account all the contribution that we've made to this Britain, not just through post-war, but you have to even go far back to the history of enslavement.
Does this feel talking to you? And if so, what are the next steps?
So not only was I involved in the campaign to try and expose this, I've been involved in the campaign for fighting for justice, working with survivors. So the compensation scheme, I've launched a petition which about 140,000 people signed. We presented that petition to Number 10, wrote to the government. They've been I've been campaigning around better mental health services. There've been a number of government inquiries. So the Home Affairs Select Committee had a report in December, a damning verdict that this compensation scheme has failed, and they've made recommendations along with my petition that the scheme should be removed from the Home Office. The Home Office is not the right place to manage a compensation scheme. They were the perpetrators of this problem in the first place. They haven't got the emotional intelligence, the competency, and the empathy to provide a service that the Windrushers deserve. So the scheme should be managed independently of the Home Office. That's really important. People should be given proper status. They shouldn't be given just biometric cards. They should be given they're British in the first place. So give them the status that they deserve, basically. And I think more importantly, there are lots of issues around. A lot of Windrushers have got a lot of health problems, but I think the point is that it's about how the community is treated. Even though it's a small percentage of the population that's been affected by the scandal, it has ramifications about our citizenship. I mean, I did a book called 100 Great Black Britain, celebrating Black British history and Black British achievements. But how British do we need to be British? How many generations of us have to be in this country to demonstrate that we are British? It raises big questions around identity and belonging.
And how has the Black Lives Matter movement over the last 2 years impacted your work and the perceptions of those Black Britons, particularly those from the Windrush Generation?
I mean, I think what happened with the murder of George Floyd, it simply just amplified the stuff that's happened in Britain. You know, you talked about your father, how he was treated by the Met Police. We have these stories, but sadly, we have to wait for an African-American male to be murdered 8 minutes, 43 seconds before now all of a sudden people now realise we have problems in the UK. We've had these problems, and like Kelsey Cochrane was murdered in 1958 during that led to Notting Hill kind of uprising, basically, which then influenced the creation of the carnival. You know, we've had so many stories of deaths in custody. We've had so many issues about racism in healthcare, discrimination in the job market. But I think Black Lives Matter has amplified this. And what's more important, there's a new generation of young people who can see this and were involved as and campaigning for this. For me, someone that's been involved in this game for a little bit longer, it's just another chapter in our struggles in Britain around racial equality. Yes, there are the implications of Black Lives Matter has meant that lots of organisations, local authorities, NHS, you know, obviously if you look at football, you know, the knee and all that stuff, the FA, the question is, how serious are they around change, or is it just simply one of these passing moments? I can remember when the murder of Stephen Lawrence happened in 1993, there was the Macpherson report, there was a changes in law, the Racial Relations Amendment Act, to give a clarity around the public sector quality duty. But what has changed from the murder of Stephen Lawrence to now, up to lead up to Black Lives Matter? If you speak to Doreen Lawrence and Neville Lawrence, they probably say very little. So we've still got a long way to go around equity, equality, and fighting for justice in this country.
And listen, we proudly boast here at Racism the Red Card as being the UK's largest anti-racism education charity. We work primarily with young school-age kids. How would you like those stories of both Black Britons and the Windrush Generation to be told in schools to 7 and 8-year-olds?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a funny thing about it. I did a campaign, you know, 100 Great Black Britons, about 17, 18 years ago. And at the time when I did a campaign, the only mention of Black history in national curriculum was the Civil Rights Movement. There's nothing at all about Black British history. There's nothing at all about Paul Stevenson, the Bristol boycott he did in 1966. There's nothing at all about the Windrush Generation and their contribution, you know, not even contribution about Black footballers like yourselves. Nothing at all. That has changed over the last several years. There's more, you know, like Mary Seacole was included in the national curriculum for the first time. You know, you've got Black abolitionists. You've got now the history of Windrush. But it's, you know, so it's a start. I mean, I did a schools competition last year where we received over 1,500 entries from schools celebrating Black British history. And it was fantastic to see more and more schools, you know, up and down the country getting involved in this. But we need to have more resources, more support for not just for teachers, but for children themselves. We need to have more TV programs, more resources available for this. I mean, the campaign for National Windrush Day has been successful. That only the campaign only became a success because of the Windrush scandal, because that again, and that's when the government decided to adopt National Windrush Day. So now more and more work has been done on Windrush. So we've got a lot of work to do. If we want to have children to be the leaders of the future, to be emotionally intelligent, have empathetic views and understanding of the intersectionality of Black and brown experiences, it starts with the school, starts at home. It's all very important. I think the work of the work that this organisation, and obviously I think Erman Housley, who I've known over the years, a key founder of that, played a key role. And that was again based on his experience of working for race equality in the 60s and 70s and 80s that influenced, the creation of the Red Card campaign and the organisation. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's unfortunate that we're in a political environment where the government does not appreciate Black British history. They do not appreciate the nuances and the contribution. And we're stuck in this time warp of a cultural war that you're woke, I'm woke, everyone's woke, without actually seriously saying, well, what type of history we're teaching? What type of world do we want to have? What type of society we want to have? It's not about dead statues of white men, by the way. That's not history. It's just a symbolism of power. It's a symbolism of a particular perspective of history, but that is not complete history.
It's a discussion we've had before about true history and true British history. That it's not just in England or the home nations, that so much of it is based around colonialization, the roles that slaves played in those Caribbean islands to the upholding and the empowering and enriching of Britain, and that those two have to be recognized. It's not just about those who have made England their home or traveled on those ships, but those who've contributed in their efforts, and as you mentioned, both on the fields and in battle.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's the funny thing about it, when going back to Black Lives Matter, a lot of people were saying, oh, Britain is not as racist as America. They had plantations in America. They treated, and they had lynchings. And of course, it's quite appalling. But we had those same experiences in the Caribbean. If you had plantations in Cornwall, Northumberland, in the West Midlands, in Wales, Scotland, we would be having the exact conversation. Yeah. It happened off planet. I'm a sci-fi person. It happened off land, so people don't make that connection between the Caribbean and that's why the Windrush scandal and our history of Windrush and the Caribbean contribution is quite important, because we're that umbilical cord and a reminder that the injustices that our ancestors face is something that we need to talk about today. And when you start to raise it, people get uncomfortable, but that's part of the history. At least America's gone through a process. It's got a long way to go. We're not even started properly the process. And when you start to have the conversation, your class is woke, or you're saying that happened a long time ago. Remember, it was only in 2015 that we stopped paying the debt for the beneficiaries that have got compensation 1853 and slavery.
Yes.
We didn't get anything at all, not even an apology, nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
Nothing at all. And yet we were paying, you were paying, I was paying as taxpayers for the likes of those people to get the compensation for their future, the ancestors. So it's ridiculous, isn't it?
It really is. Listen, as your people say, to know where we're going, we have to know where we've been. Thank you very much for your efforts in highlighting the role that we've all played in making Britain what it is today, the outsized role that generation was a part of and seems to want to be forgotten and pitted out of our history. Patrick, I think it's important for all of us to always be reminded of that journey, of what has made us who we are, in an effort to go forward. Thanks again for your time. It really has been enlightening and empowering.
No, thank you very much, and keep up with your podcast and the work of the organisation as well.
Thank you. We certainly will.